Hello, Lovelace, and welcome to today's English lesson. As you can see from our statement here, can I understand the model text? Okay, very straightforward brief today. I'm going to share with you our model text, and I just want us to be happy with its content, with what it's talking about. Now, remember, we've moved on from our narrative, we've moved on from our overcoming the monster story, and we're now looking at non-chronological reports. So the information we're writing now, the information we're presenting now is factual. Okay. This is the sort of text that you might find in an information book. So if you were looking for a topic book on the Anglo-Saxons, this might be the sort of page you would look at. Okay, that's the type of text that we're trying to create. Now, more about our model text in a moment, but we're going to start with our short write task. Okay. I'm going to get you today to join a couple pairs of short sentences. Okay, lots of ways of doing this. There's lots of connectives out there that are really, really useful tools for joining sentences together. So, how many different ways can you think of to join these sentences together? Now, can't change the meaning, but you can change the structure a little bit if that helps you. So I'm going to give you an example. Now, you can use this example as one of yours, but I will be incredibly disappointed if we can't come up with quite a few other ways of joining these sentences together. So let's take a look. First one here, the woman made the tunic, and the tunic was made of wool. Okay, so two sentences relating to our Anglo-Saxon topic. So we've got a woman here who makes a tunic, okay, and a tunic is a piece of clothing, and the tunic was made of wool. Two sentences, but they might be a little bit more impressive if we join them together. We just created one slightly longer, say more complex sentence. So let's try it with which, so you get the idea. So the woman made the tunic, which the tunic was made of wool. Now that doesn't sound very good. So I think we're going to have to do a little bit of editing. We're going to have to crop away some of the words to make that work. So let's try again. What about the woman made the tunic, which was made of wool? We don't need to say the tunic twice. So we've adjusted the sentences a little bit to make it work. The meaning has not changed. Okay, so we're not going to change the meaning, but we're going to come up with different words, different connectives that will help us link these two sentences together, okay, and create a complex sentence. Right, so the woman made the tunic, which was made of wool. What about this one? The man lifted the sword. The sword glinted in the light. Can we use which again here? Let's have a look. The man lifted the sword, which the sword glinted in the light. Once again, left in too many words, doesn't make sense. I need to be more careful. So what about this? The man lifted the sword, which glinted in the light. There we go. Makes perfect sense. Okay, and we've been able to link those two sentences together. Okay, you can change the structure of the sentence, okay, but please don't change the meaning. So two pairs of sentences. How many different ways can you come up with to link those together? Okay, so there's your short write task for today. You can pause the video right now if you'd like to have a go at that, or come back to the task at the end of the lesson, entirely up to you. Now, here is our model text. Now, yes, it does look quite long. It does look like there's a lot of information, and that's because there is a lot of information. And as I said earlier, this is the sort of thing you might see if you picked up an information text about the Anglo-Saxons. You go to the contents page at the beginning and you scan down, you think, oh, Anglo-Saxon society. I'm interested in that. I want to find out some more. And it tells you which page to go to. And you go there, and then there's a big double page all about Anglo-Saxon society. There'll be some pictures in there. There'll be some captions to go with the pictures. There'll be some subheadings to break the page down. And then there'll be lots of information. Okay. Now, the whole point of today is quite simple. I am going to read through this passage. You can follow it as well. And we're going to just pick out any words I think you might be new, that might be new to you. Okay. So that by the end of it, that we're clear with pretty much everything that's on the page. Hope that makes sense. Okay. So just to allow us to focus a little bit, I'm just going to delete part of the page, or it's not gone anywhere. I just don't want you reading ahead too far. Okay, so we're going to just start with that first paragraph and see what that tells us. This is usually with this type of text, the first paragraph is basically a summary or a little overview. It gives us a sort of the headlines, as it were. Okay, so a brief introduction to everything that's coming up. The Saxon people didn't all have great lives. Wealthy or not, all of them had endured some hard times. Despite this, society was split into 3 categories. The Saxon nobility and upper classes, so for example, the kings, the Eldermen and the thanes, who were like landlords. Next were all the commoners, who were called Thralls, who were a group consisting of farmers and craftsmen. Lastly, slaves or thralls, whose lives were hard and mostly miserable. Okay, so all this paragraph is telling us is that Anglo-Saxon society was split up into 3 levels. You had the upper class, the middle class, and the bottom of the pile. Okay, so at the top, the most important people, the nobility, the upper classes, these were the kings, obviously, the Eldermen, okay, and the thanes. And the thanes were like the landlords, so they ruled over areas of land. So they were up at the top. Next down were the commoners, or the ceorls. Now the ceorls were basically the farmers and the craftsmen. So these were skilled people, but they weren't particularly wealthy or weren't particularly powerful. They were skilled people, either skilled in a particular craft or they were skilled and they knew their job as farmers. And then finally, at the bottom of the pile, we had the slaves or the thralls, and their lives were hard and miserable. Okay, they did a lot of the hard labor, so really, really miserable time. All right, so just a general introduction that their society was split into 3 distinct levels, and we're going to look at each one now. We're going to break it down. So our next subheading, social hierarchy. Okay, so this just explains it a little bit more. Overall, the social hierarchy in Anglo-Saxon England was regarded fair and created a perfect solution for the 2 main needs at the time. One was the organised workforce, whose duties were defined clearly by their stations, and secondly, an army which could be constructed and taken to the field with minimal preparation. So what that paragraph is telling us is that this 3-layer society worked. Okay, it seemed fair, and it solved their 2 main problems, or their 2 main needs. And that was identifying the workforce, so they knew who did what job. It was very clear who should be doing which job. And also, they knew exactly where they could get their fighting force from if they ever needed to go to battle. They didn't have a permanent army, a big, large army just sitting there training or twiddling their thumbs. Big parts of their fighting force came from the commoners, came from the everyday people. Okay, but they knew exactly where to go to get these people. So the hierarchy, these 3 levels, did work for Anglo-Saxon society. So let's go to the middle of the pile, the commoners. Okay, so commoners in the Anglo-Saxon period, known as ceorls, were the craftsmen and the farmers. These were the majority of the people, So most Anglo-Saxons fell into this group. While some were successful landowners, there were some that were not that wealthy, living as agricultural labourers under their landlord's rights. Although all were craftsmen and farmers, they could all have been summoned to join the freed if they were called. If they were called, they were required by law to join. The freed was an army of poorly armed fighters who had not undergone any training at all. The commoners could not afford their own weapons and armour, which meant that their chances in a fight were not great. The best weapons they were able to acquire were spears, but most were only armed with hammers, axes, and scythes, which were easily accessible through their work. Okay, so what that paragraph is telling us is that the biggest part of the social hierarchy, so the biggest part of those three levels, was this middle group, the commoners. Now, the commoners were the farmers, the craftsmen, and so on. Okay? Some of them owned their own land. Some of them were just the skilled workforce for their landlords. But they were legally required to join the freed. Now, the freed was basically an army, a group of men who, by law, had to fight if their king called on them. So they would join this makeshift army. They didn't have any real training, and they didn't have any real weapons. The only weapons they had was what they could gather themselves. So a lot of their weapons consisted of tools they would use normally on the farm. Tools like scythes and axes. They might be able to lay their hands or make their own spear or something like that, but it would be very, very unlikely that they would have any armor or any proper weapons like swords. Okay? So they would just be expected to take part in the battle, not properly trained and not with proper weapons. And so their chances in the battles were not particularly good. Now, if we move on to the nobility and the upper class, okay, the Anglo-Saxon upper class and nobility consisted of the kings, the very top of the pile, the king, eldermen, and thanes. Now, the nobility was led by the kings, who ruled over large areas of land called kingdoms. Next were the eldermen, who controlled the various districts on behalf of the ruler. Okay, so they were basically the king's second in command. They would go around check that things were being done properly, as the king wished. The eldermen had significant power that was often responsible for law and order, therefore were tasked with providing justice. They were also in charge of the militia, which was formed by local commoners in times of war. Okay, so the militia is this makeshift army, the freed. The freed is the law saying they have to join the militia. Below the eldermen were the thanes. Now, the thanes are the professional military. These are trained soldiers, and the professional military in service to either the king or the eldermen. Some served the king and had the possibility to gain a place in the king's home, while others owned land in their own rights. These thanes had the duty to create a solid foundation for the army and to fight for the kingdom. When they were not actively on duty in the military, they took care of local organizations, both of men-at-arms and trade routes. Okay, so 3 people there mentioned in the upper class: the king, who's obviously in charge of their entire kingdom; the elderman, who was in charge of districts, areas of the kingdom, and took care very much of law and order; and then the thanes, who were actually trained soldiers, and they would help with basic training, ensuring that the commoners actually turned up and took part in battles when they were summoned. And when there wasn't a war or a battle going on, then it was up to the thanes, these trained soldiers, okay, to where possible, give some basic training to the commoners, but also look after various organizations within the kingdom and keep trade routes clear. Okay, so to ensure people could trade without fear of piracy or theft or invasion and so on. Okay, so they would sort of police the trade routes and keep them safe for traders. Okay, so that would be the job of those three tiers of upper class: king, elderman, and thane. And finally, we have the slaves. The bottom of the pile, this is a term I'm sure you're familiar with. It's a horrible term. And I say, fingers crossed, it's all but gone in today's world. I know there are still examples around the world, but fingers crossed it's all but gone, because this is the bottom of the structure of society in Anglo-Saxon times and consisted of the slaves, who were called bondsmen or thralls. Slaves were either prisoners captured during wars, Britons who were native to Great Britain, or Saxons who had fallen into debt and who literally had to sell themselves to slavery to pay off that debt. They did not have many rights under the law, and they could be harshly punished without any thought of justice. Punishment, which includes being killed, was easy to receive for slaves. So slaves didn't have many rights, they didn't have much protection from the law, and they were treated particularly badly. Okay? So Saxon slaves were often slaves because they had fallen into debt. They owed money. And so they literally sold themselves into slavery to pay off that debt. Other slaves included prisoners of war and so on. Okay? So there's the information. Hopefully, most of that is pretty clear. I know there are some tricky words in there. It's not the easiest of texts. So feel free to have another read through yourself. But basically, it is explaining to you that Anglo-Saxons broke their society down into three levels: the nobility and upper class, the commoners, and the slaves. Now, we'll be looking more at this text over the days ahead, understand how we put it together, the use of the various sort of subheadings, the tenses that we use of images and captions, and so on and so on, with the aim ultimately that you create your own non-chronological report on some facet of Viking life that you find interesting. So it's not going to have to be society. You can able to go away and research any part of Viking life to produce your non-chronological report. But for now, we're just going to spend a few days looking at this one, understanding how it's built, look at some of the phrasing, some of the important word choices, and so on and so on. Okay. But for now, that is the end of today's lesson. Make sure you get that short task done, linking those sentences together. But for now, take care of yourself, take care of those around you, and I will see you again soon.